You know what's strange? Most men don't actually suffer because someone doesn't love them back. They suffer because they can't tell what's real anymore. And I need you to sit with that for a second. Because the confusion is the part that keeps you awake at 2 a.m., replaying tiny moments like they were crime scene evidence. The long pauses between texts. The way she looked at you that one night. The sudden distance after weeks of warmth. The mixed signals. The almost confessions. The feeling that something is there, but somehow you can never fully touch it. That uncertainty becomes addictive. And if you've ever found yourself watching videos like this late at night, searching for answers you pretend you don't care about during the day, then subscribe. Not because I'm trying to build an audience, but because some part of you is tired of being emotionally blind in your own life. You've been told to stop overthinking, but honestly, sometimes you're not overthinking at all. Sometimes you're finally noticing things your heart tried to protect you from. See, what most men get completely wrong about feelings is they assume feelings behave logically. They think, if she cares, she'll show it clearly. If someone pulls away, they must not feel anything. If the connection was real, it wouldn't become confusing. But human beings are not that clean, especially when emotion, fear, attraction, shame, timing, loneliness, ego, and past wounds all collide inside the same person. A woman can miss you and avoid you at the same time. She can feel deeply connected to you and still choose someone else. She can think about you every day and still never reach out. And I know some men hear that and immediately think it's manipulation. Sometimes it is. But a lot of the time, it's internal conflict. And that's the part nobody teaches you. You're sitting there trying to decode behavior with logic, while the other person is acting from emotion they barely understand themselves. That's why you keep feeling crazy, because you're trying to solve a psychological storm with simple math. You think, she said this, so it must mean that. No, not always. People say what they can handle saying. That's different from truth. I remember talking to a man once, probably mid-30s, successful, calm voice, intelligent, and he kept asking me the same question in different forms for almost an hour. She said she didn't want a relationship, so why did it feel so real? And underneath that question was another one he was too ashamed to ask directly. Was I delusional? That's the fear, isn't it? Not rejection, delusion. The possibility that maybe all those moments only mattered to you. And when a man starts doubting his own emotional reality, something dangerous happens quietly inside him. He disconnects from his instincts. He starts distrusting his perception, second-guessing every interaction, needing constant reassurance, analyzing instead of feeling. And eventually, he loses the ability to tell when someone genuinely cares. Because he's too busy searching for certainty that doesn't exist. That's the trap. You want absolute clarity from emotionally imperfect human beings. You want people to communicate feelings with the precision of legal contracts. But feelings leak out sideways, through hesitation, through tension, through inconsistency, through strange timing, through silence. Sometimes silence says more than honesty ever could. And I think deep down, you already know that. Because there's probably someone you still think about, not because they loved you perfectly, but because something about them felt emotionally unfinished. Unresolved feelings are the hardest to release. The human brain hates open loops. That's why you keep returning to the memory. Not necessarily because the connection was extraordinary, but because it never reached a clean ending. And tonight, I want to challenge something you may have believed for years. Closure is not always the truth. Sometimes closure is just the story someone gives you because the real explanation is too uncomfortable, too complicated, or too emotionally messy to say out loud. And the worst part? You've probably done this too. You've probably told someone, "I'm just busy," when you were emotionally overwhelmed, or "I'm fine," when you were quietly collapsing inside, or pretended not to care because caring felt humiliating. So why do you expect everyone else to communicate perfectly when you know firsthand how difficult honesty becomes once feelings are involved? That's where we have to begin. Not with blaming them, Not with blaming yourself, but with understanding that human emotion is far more contradictory than most people are emotionally prepared to admit. There's a moment that happens to a lot of men, and almost nobody talks about it honestly. It usually happens after the excitement fades, after the chasing, after the overanalyzing, after the emotional adrenaline burns out just enough for silence to become louder than hope. And suddenly, one thought slips in. Why do I feel more attached to people who confuse me than to people who actually choose me? That question changes everything, because now we're no longer talking about them, we're talking about you. And I don't mean that in a blaming way. I mean it in the way a psychologist notices patterns before someone is emotionally ready to see them. See, certainty feels calm. But uncertainty? Uncertainty creates obsession. When someone gives you consistent affection, emotional safety, clear communication, your nervous system relaxes. There's peace in that. But when someone gives you warmth one day and distance the next, your brain starts working overtime. You become hyper-aware, hyper-attached, hyper-focused. Not because the connection is deeper, because the uncertainty itself becomes emotionally stimulating. And this is where many men accidentally misunderstand their own feelings. They think intensity equals meaning. It doesn't always. Sometimes intensity is anxiety wearing the mask of love. I know that sounds uncomfortable, but think about the people you struggled hardest to move on from. Were they truly the healthiest connection? Or were they the ones who made you feel emotionally unstable while giving you just enough affection to keep hope alive? That tiny reward after emotional distance, that sudden message after days of silence, that one vulnerable conversation after weeks of confusion, your brain clings to it. Because intermittent emotional validation is incredibly powerful psychologically. Casinos work the same way. You don't become addicted because you win every time. You become addicted because you might. And when feelings are involved, men often mistake emotional unpredictability for depth. That's why some of you keep chasing closure from people who emotionally exhausted you. Not because you're weak, because your nervous system got attached to the cycle. And I really need you to hear this next part carefully. Someone can genuinely care about you and still not be emotionally safe for you. Those are two completely different things. A woman may cry over losing you, miss you deeply, compare other men to you for years, and still be incapable of giving you the consistency your heart actually needed. That doesn't make her evil, it makes her human. Wounded people often create wounded dynamics without fully understanding what they're doing, and men do this too. Sometimes a man says he wants peace, but secretly chooses emotionally unavailable women because calm intimacy feels unfamiliar to him. Chaos feels more emotionally convincing because it matches old emotional wounds, especially if he grew up feeling unseen, emotionally uncertain, or like love had to be earned. Then suddenly he meets someone inconsistent, and his nervous system whispers, "This feels important." No, it feels familiar. That's different. And once you realize that, your entire dating history starts rearranging itself in your mind. You stop asking, "Why can't I get over her?" and start asking, "Why did uncertainty feel more emotionally valuable to me than stability?" That question is terrifying, because now you can't just blame the other person anymore. Now you have to confront the possibility that part of you was emotionally participating in the confusion. Not consciously, but psychologically. I've seen men stay emotionally attached for years to women they barely even had a relationship with. Do you know why? Because fantasy fills gaps reality never got the chance to close. The less complete the relationship was, the easier it becomes to idealize. Your mind starts editing the story. You remember the chemistry, the tension, the eye contact, the potential. But not the anxiety, not the emotional inconsistency, not the sleepless nights spent trying to decode simple communication. Your brain romanticizes unfinished emotional experiences because unfinished stories keep imagination alive. Reality ends fantasies. Distance feeds them. And maybe that's why some men secretly prefer longing over actual intimacy. Longing is safer. In longing, nobody fully sees your flaws. Nobody disappoints you completely. Nobody stays long enough for real vulnerability to begin. You can remain emotionally suspended in possibility. But real relationships? Real relationships eventually force two imperfect people to stop performing and start revealing who they actually are. And honestly, that's where many connections collapse. Not because feelings were fake, but because feelings alone are never enough to sustain emotional maturity. You know what hurts men more than rejection? Being emotionally replaced while they're still trying to understand what happened. That feeling, it does something violent to the ego. Not loud violence, quiet violence. The kind that changes how a man looks at himself when nobody's around. Because when someone moves on faster than you expected, your mind immediately starts creating explanations. She never cared. It was all fake. I meant nothing. But those explanations are usually less about truth and more about self-protection. Human beings struggle to accept emotional complexity because complexity doesn't soothe pain quickly enough. It's easier to believe someone was heartless than to accept they were conflicted. And this is where so many men become emotionally trapped. They keep searching for evidence that the connection was real. Old messages, tiny details, social media behavior, the tone of her voice during one specific conversation 6 months ago. Because if the feelings were real, then your pain feels justified, right? But I want to tell you something difficult. The reality of someone's feelings does not automatically determine the reality of your future together. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Someone can genuinely love aspects of you, need you emotionally, feel safe with you, desire you deeply, and still not choose you long-term. That's the part movies never prepare people for. Feelings do not erase incompatibility. Feelings do not heal emotional immaturity. Feelings do not guarantee courage. Sometimes people walk away from relationships that matter deeply to them because staying would force them to confront parts of themselves they're not ready to face. And men often personalize this. They think, if I were better, she would have stayed. No, sometimes you were the mirror, and people don't always stay where they feel emotionally exposed, especially if they've spent years avoiding themselves. You'd be shocked how many people confuse emotional comfort with emotional connection. Comfort says, you help me avoid my pain. Connection says, you help me see myself honestly. Those are not the same thing. The second one is far more threatening. That's why some people disappear right after intimacy deepens. Not physical intimacy, emotional intimacy. The moment they feel truly seen. Because being seen sounds romantic, until it actually happens. Then it becomes terrifying. Now there's pressure, vulnerability, accountability, the risk of disappointment. And suddenly, avoidance feels safer than closeness. A lot of women do this. A lot of men do this too. But men often misinterpret withdrawal as proof they lacked value, when sometimes their presence simply became emotionally overwhelming to someone unprepared for depth. Again, that does not mean you should romanticize unhealthy behavior. Please don't twist this into, she pulled away because she loved me too much. No, sometimes people pull away because they're confused, or emotionally unavailable, or attached elsewhere, or exhausted, or afraid, or simply incompatible with you. But reducing every emotional shift to she never cared is emotionally immature too. Real life is usually sadder and more complicated than that. And if I'm honest, I think one reason this topic affects men so deeply is because many men were never taught how to process emotional ambiguity. You were taught to pursue, win, secure certainty, control outcomes. But relationships don't operate like achievements. You cannot logic someone into emotional readiness. You cannot perfectly perform your way into permanent attachment. And once a man realizes that, he faces a very painful truth. Love cannot be controlled through effort alone. That realization breaks something, especially in men who built their identity around being enough. Because now they're forced to confront the possibility that someone can appreciate them deeply and still leave. And that feels unbearable at first, but eventually, it becomes freeing. Because when you stop trying to force emotional permanence, you start paying attention to something more important. Reciprocity. Not chemistry, not intensity, not potential. Reciprocity. Who chooses you consistently when confusion is no longer exciting? Who communicates instead of disappearing? Who stays emotionally present after the fantasy phase fades? Who makes you feel calmer instead of more psychologically addicted? That's the shift mature men eventually make. They stop asking, "How strongly did she feel?" and start asking, "How safely can we actually love each other?" That question changes your entire life. Because deep down, what destroys most men emotionally isn't lack of love. It's chasing emotional experiences that constantly force them to abandon themselves just to keep the connection alive. There's a point in this pattern where a man stops reacting and starts observing himself instead. And honestly, that moment can feel a bit unsettling because you notice things you didn't want to notice before, like how quickly your mood shifts based on one message or the absence of it. How a single notification can lift your entire day and a lack of one can quietly drain it. You start realizing you weren't just interested in her, you were regulated by her. And that distinction is not small. It's actually the core of a lot of emotional confusion men experience in relationships. Because when someone becomes your emotional anchor without meaning to, your nervous system begins to outsource stability to them. So instead of asking, "Do I like this person?" you unconsciously start asking, "Are they available right now? And do I still matter to them today?" That shift is subtle, but powerful, and it creates a kind of internal instability that feels like love, but behaves like dependence. I want to be careful here because this isn't about shaming attachment. Attachment is human. We are built for connection. But healthy attachment feels like grounding. Unhealthy attachment feels like tension. And tension is what keeps you checking your phone when you promised yourself you wouldn't. It's what makes you reread old conversations trying to decode tone like it's a hidden message. It's what makes you imagine entire emotional narratives from a single delayed reply. Not because you're irrational, but because your nervous system is trying to restore certainty. And uncertainty, once it settles into your emotional system, becomes physically uncomfortable. So you try to solve it. But here's the trap. You cannot solve emotional inconsistency with more thinking. You just end up deeper inside it. I remember a man once telling me something that stuck. He said, almost embarrassed, "I don't even know if I miss her, or if I miss the version of myself I was when she used to talk to me every day." That's an important distinction, because sometimes what you're grieving isn't the person, it's who you became in the presence of their attention. More hopeful, more alive, more focused, more emotionally open than you usually allow yourself to be. And when that disappears, it feels like loss. But part of what you're actually reacting to is withdrawal from emotional stimulation. That doesn't make the connection meaningless, it just makes it more complicated than simple love stories. And this is where many men get stuck for a long time. They keep trying to get back the emotional version of themselves that existed inside that dynamic. But here's what's uncomfortable. That version of you was not stable. It was activated. Activated by uncertainty, activated by inconsistency, activated by emotional highs and lows. And your brain often confuses activation with aliveness. But calm is not emptiness. Calm is what emotional safety feels like when you're not used to it yet. At first, calm can feel almost wrong, too quiet, too stable, too uneventful. Because your nervous system got trained to equate emotional intensity with importance. So when something is consistent, your mind may interpret it as boring. But that's not truth, that's conditioning. And this is where a lot of men unknowingly repeat the same cycle. They leave stable connections too early, not because those connections lacked depth, but because depth without emotional chaos feels unfamiliar. Meanwhile, they stay emotionally attached to inconsistent connections long after they've ended, because the nervous system still remembers the spikes. And I need you to understand something very clearly. Your emotional intensity is not always your intuition. Sometimes it's your history repeating itself in real time. The body remembers patterns before the mind admits them. That's why you can meet someone new who is objectively better for you and still feel less excited, less anxious, less obsessed, less consumed. And instead of recognizing that as safety, you interpret it as lack of chemistry. But chemistry without safety is not a foundation, it's a signal. a signal that something in you is still drawn to emotional unpredictability. And that realization doesn't mean you need to judge yourself. It just means you start paying attention to a different kind of question. Not how strong is this feeling, but what kind of emotional state does this person create inside me over time? Because real connection doesn't just show up in moments of intensity, it shows up in how you feel after the conversation ends. When the phone is down, when the silence returns, when you're just yourself again. Do you feel grounded? Or slightly destabilized, waiting for the next emotional spike? That answer tells you more than any message ever will. There's something men rarely say out loud, but almost all of them feel at some point. It's this quiet discomfort that shows up when you realize you've been trying harder to be understood than the other person has been trying to understand you. And it doesn't hit all at once. It builds slowly, in small moments. You say something meaningful, and it gets half acknowledged. You ask something honest, and the answer stays surface level. You show consistency, and receive inconsistency back. And at first, you explain it away. Maybe she's busy. Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe she just communicates differently. And sometimes those explanations are true. But there's a line where explanation turns into self-abandonment, and most men cross it without realizing. Because wanting clarity can start to feel like needing too much. So you lower your expectations. You become more patient than you should be, more understanding than you feel, more forgiving than the situation actually requires. And slowly, you start participating in your own confusion. Not because you're naive, because you're trying to preserve something that still feels emotionally valuable. But here's the uncomfortable truth. When someone is genuinely aligned with you, you don't have to convince yourself to stay grounded. You don't spend most of your time interpreting silence. You don't feel like you're decoding emotional patterns just to maintain basic connection. You don't feel like you're almost there all the time. That almost feeling is powerful. It keeps people stuck for months, sometimes years. Because almost keeps hope alive without requiring actual change. Almost committed, almost honest, almost ready, almost available, almost consistent. And your mind fills in the rest. That's the dangerous part. Your imagination starts doing emotional labor that reality is not providing. And you begin relating not to the person in front of you, but to the version of them you believe is possible. And I want to pause here, because this is where many men become deeply attached. Not to reality, but to potential. Potential is intoxicating because it allows you to feel like you're part of something meaningful before it actually exists in stable form. You're not just dating a person, you're participating in a future story. A version where things finally click, where communication improves, where effort becomes mutual, where clarity finally arrives. But potential doesn't behave like reality. It doesn't hold you when you're anxious. It doesn't respond to your messages. It doesn't show up consistently. Only people do that. And sometimes, the hardest emotional maturity is learning to separate what could be true from what is actually being lived right now. Because if you stay too long inside potential, you slowly start tolerating behaviors you would normally walk away from. Not because you lack standards, but because you're emotionally invested in a future that hasn't materialized. And this is where men often feel the deepest internal conflict. Because part of you knows, you can feel it, that slight instability, that lack of clarity, that emotional inconsistency. But another part of you keeps saying, it's not that bad. And that sentence, it's not that bad, is often the beginning of emotional erosion. Not dramatic loss, gradual loss. Loss of self-respect in small increments, loss of emotional clarity, loss of boundaries you used to have without effort, loss of the version of you who would have walked away earlier. And I want to be careful here because this is not about turning you against connection or making you fearful of love. It's actually the opposite. This is about protecting your ability to recognize real connection when it appears. Because when your emotional standards get blurred by inconsistency, even good connections can start to feel uncertain. You stop trusting your own perception. You start asking others what your experience means. And slowly, you lose something very important, your internal compass. And once that happens, relationships become more confusing than they need to be. Not because people are always unclear, but because you stop trusting what clarity feels like when it's actually present. And rebuilding that compass doesn't happen through more analysis. It happens through honesty. Quiet, uncomfortable honesty with yourself. The kind that says, "This doesn't feel stable even if I want it to." This connection requires more emotional effort than it gives back. I am spending more time managing uncertainty than experiencing connection. Those are not dramatic statements, they're grounding statements. And grounding is what pulls you out of emotional fog, even when the feelings are still there.